A young billionaire stopped his Ferrari when he saw a little girl fall off her bicycle. He helped her up, but when she looked at him and said, "Thank you, Daddy," he was stunned. The soft purr of the Ferrari's engine echoed through the quiet streets of a suburban neighborhood as Thomas, a 30-year-old young billionaire, drove without haste. His green eyes, usually focused on spreadsheets and contracts, now wandered over the well-kept houses and blooming gardens passing by the window. The afternoon sun bathed everything in a golden light, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. Thomas adjusted his sunglasses, thinking about how much his life had changed in recent years. From one group home to another in his childhood, to the halls of high society and conference rooms of Fortune 500 companies. Sometimes he still wondered if it was all just an elaborate dream. It was then that a sudden movement caught his attention. A small figure on a pink bicycle appeared in his field of vision, pedaling clumsily along the sidewalk. Thomas smiled, recalling his own childhood and the endless attempts to ride a bike in the yard of the group home. But his smile instantly vanished when he saw the girl lose her balance. As if in slow motion, he watched the child, who couldn't have been more than 5, fall from the bicycle. The sharp scream that tore through the air made Thomas react instinctively. In one swift motion, he parked the Ferrari by the curb and got out of the car in seconds. His custom-made Italian shoes barely touched the asphalt as he ran toward the fallen girl. "Hey, little one, are you okay?" Thomas asked, kneeling beside the child. His eyes quickly scanned her for serious injuries. The girl, with blonde hair tied in messy pigtails, looked at him with large blue eyes filled with tears. Her lower lip trembled, but she seemed more scared than hurt. "My knee," she sobbed, pointing to a small scrape on her leg. Thomas gave her a kind smile, taking a handkerchief from the pocket of his Armani suit. "Don't worry, we'll clean this up," he said, carefully wiping the dirt from the girl's knee. "See, that wasn't so bad." The girl sniffled, her tears subsiding as she watched Thomas curiously. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of innocence and wisdom that intrigued him. "What's your name, little one?" Thomas asked, helping her to her feet. "Sophie," she answered, her voice still a bit shaky. "Well, Sophie, you're a very brave girl," Thomas said, smiling. "How about we try to get you back on that bicycle?" Sophie nodded timidly, allowing Thomas to guide her back to the fallen bike. He lifted it carefully, checking for damage before helping Sophie onto the seat again. "Now remember," Thomas said, holding the handlebars while Sophie settled herself, "keep your eyes forward and pedal with confidence. You can do it." With a gentle push, Thomas let go of the bike. Sophie pedaled hesitantly at first, but quickly gained confidence, her face lighting up with a radiant smile. "I'm doing it!" she shouted with joy, pedaling in circles around Thomas. Thomas laughed, feeling a sudden wave of pride. Then it happened. Sophie stopped the bike beside him, her eyes shining with happiness, and spoke the words that would change everything. "Thank you, Daddy." Thomas's world seemed to freeze. He blinked, sure he had misheard. What did you call me?" Sophie tilted her head, confused by his reaction. "Daddy," she repeated, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Thomas felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Memories long buried began to resurface in his mind. Recollections of a childhood spent in foster care, always wondering about his real parents, about his true identity. He looked at Sophie, studying her face. There was something familiar about her, something he couldn't explain, a connection that went beyond their brief encounter. "Sophie," he said softly, "where do you live? We need to get you home." The girl pointed to a blue house at the end of the street. "Over there," she said cheerfully, apparently forgetting the earlier incident. Thomas hesitated for a moment. Part of him just wanted to say goodbye and return to his normal life, but something stronger pushed him to find out more. With a sigh, he grabbed Sophie's bike in one hand and offered his other hand to the girl. "Let's go, I'll walk you home," he said, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. As they walked along the sidewalk, Thomas couldn't help noticing how perfectly Sophie's small hand fit into his own. It was both comforting and frightening. How could he feel such a strong connection to a child he had just met? As they approached the blue house, Thomas felt his heart race. He didn't know what to expect, but he had a feeling that his life was about to change drastically. Sophie skipped beside him, chattering happily about her school, her friends, and her pet cat. Thomas listened with half an ear, his mind racing with possibilities and questions. Finally, they reached the front door. Thomas took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. He raised his hand and knocked, the sound echoing like a herald of change. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door slowly opened, revealing a woman of about 30. She had wavy brown hair and the same piercing blue eyes as Sophie. The instant their eyes met, Thomas knew something extraordinary was happening. The woman paled, her eyes widening in shock. She staggered backward, gripping the door as if she needed support. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas stood frozen, unable to understand the woman's reaction. It was as if she were seeing a ghost. "Mommy," Sophie called cheerfully, shattering the tense silence. "Look who helped me when I fell off my bike." The woman blinked, as though waking from a trance. Her gaze shifted from Thomas to Sophie, confusion evident on her face. "Sophie, honey," she said, her voice trembling, "why don't you go inside and wash your hands for dinner?" Sophie nodded, flashing Thomas a final smile before running inside, leaving Thomas and the woman alone, staring at each other in a silence heavy with tension. I'm sorry," Thomas finally managed to say. "Sophie fell off her bike and I just wanted to make sure she got home safely." The woman continued to stare at him, her eyes scrutinizing every detail of his face. She seemed to be struggling to form words. Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas frowned, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "My name is Thomas. Thomas Blackwood. I was just passing by when I saw Sophie fall." Upon hearing his name, the woman let out a strangled sound, half sob, half gasp. She leaned heavily against the door, seeming on the verge of fainting. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Thomas asked, taking a step forward in concern. She raised a hand as if to ward him off. I'm fine," she said, though her voice and appearance indicated otherwise. "It's just, you look exactly like—" She didn't finish the sentence, leaving Thomas even more confused and intrigued. "Look like who?" he gently pressed, sensing he was on the verge of an important revelation. The woman shook her head as though trying to clear her thoughts. "I'm sorry," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Anne. Thank you for bringing Sophie home safely." Thomas nodded slowly, realizing there was far more to this situation than met the eye. "Anne," he said, testing her name, "is there something going on here that I should know about?" Anne hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between Thomas and the street behind him. I don't know," she finally said. "It's complicated." Thomas felt a sudden determination forming inside him. He couldn't just walk away now, not with so many unanswered questions. "Anne," he said softly, "I know we just met, but I have this feeling that I need to understand what's happening here. Can we talk?" Anne seemed to wrestle with herself for a moment before finally nodding. "All right," she said, opening the door wider. "Come in. I think we have a lot to discuss." Thomas stepped hesitantly into the house, feeling as though he were crossing not only a physical threshold, but a metaphorical one. As the door closed behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover truths that would change his life forever. The interior of the house was cozy and modest, with family photos lining the walls and toys scattered across the living room floor. Thomas followed Anne into the kitchen, where she motioned for him to sit at the table. "Coffee," she offered, her voice still trembling. Thomas nodded, watching as Anne moved about the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared the cups. The silence between them was palpable, heavy with unasked questions and unrevealed secrets. Finally, Anne sat down across from him, placing a steaming cup before him. Their eyes met, and Thomas saw a mix of fear, hope, and something he couldn't identify. "Before we begin," Anne said quietly, "I need to know, do you know anything about your biological family?" The question caught Thomas off guard. He frowned, memories of his childhood in foster care flooding his mind. "Not much," he admitted. "I was abandoned as a baby. I grew up in the foster system until I was adopted at age 10. Anne closed her eyes, as though Thomas's words confirmed something she had feared. When she opened them again, unshed tears shimmered there. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think you might be my husband's twin brother." The world seemed to stop. Thomas felt as though he'd been struck by lightning. He looked at Anne, certain he'd misheard. "What?" he managed, his voice hoarse. Anne took a deep breath, appearing to gather her courage. "My husband, Paul, he looks exactly like you, and he was abandoned as a baby, too." Thomas felt his head spin. A twin brother. Could it be possible? All his life, he'd wondered about his origins. And now, where is Paul now? He asked, barely recognizing his own voice. Anne's face contorted with pain. He left us 6 months ago. No explanation, no warning. He just disappeared." The pieces began to fit together in Thomas's mind. Sophie's reaction when she called him Daddy. Anne's shock upon seeing him. "That's why Sophie called me Daddy," he murmured, more to himself than to Anne. Anne nodded, tears now streaming freely down her face. She misses him terribly. Seeing you must have been..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. Thomas could imagine the impact his sudden appearance must have had on the little girl. A million questions raced through Thomas's mind about Paul, about their shared past, about how they'd been separated. But before he could voice any of them, the sound of small footsteps echoed down the hall. Sophie entered the kitchen, her eyes lighting up when she saw Thomas still there. "Are you staying for dinner, Daddy?" she asked innocently. Thomas and Anne exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. There was so much to discuss, so much to find out. But for now there was a child who needed stability and love. "If your mum doesn't mind," Thomas said gently, looking at Anne for approval. Anne hesitated for a moment before nodding slowly. "Sure," she said, forcing a smile. "Thomas can stay for dinner." As Sophie cheered happily, Thomas felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Confusion, hope, fear of the unknown. But above all, an overwhelming sense that his life was about to change forever. He looked at Anne, who watched him with a mixture of caution and curiosity, and at Sophie, whose innocence and joy were a reminder of what truly mattered. Thomas didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. The fateful encounter that afternoon was only the beginning of a journey that promised to be as challenging as it was transformative. And so, as the sun set outside, casting golden shadows through the cozy kitchen, Thomas found himself on the threshold of a new chapter in his life, one filled with mysteries to unravel, bonds to forge, and perhaps a family to rediscover. As Sophie chatted excitedly about her day at school, Thomas and Anne exchanged meaningful looks over the dinner table. There was a world of unasked questions hovering between them, but they silently agreed that this wasn't the moment to explore them. Dinner unfolded in a surreal atmosphere. Thomas found himself studying every detail of Sophie's face, searching for resemblances to his own. The way she wrinkled her nose when she laughed, the sparkle in her eyes when she told a story, were they familiar gestures he saw in his mirror every day? Anne, for her part, seemed to be struggling to keep her composure. Her hands trembled slightly as she served the food, and her eyes often filled with tears she quickly blinked away. When dinner ended and Sophie was tucked into bed, Thomas and Anne found themselves back in the living room, the silence between them heavy with expectation. "I know you must have 1,000 questions," Anne began, her voice low and tired. "And I promise I'll try to answer what I can, but this is a lot to process all at once." Thomas nodded. feeling the weight of the situation. "I understand," he said softly. "To be honest, I don't even know where to start." Anne gave a sad smile. Maybe we can start at the beginning. You said you were adopted at 10. What happened before that?" Thomas took a deep breath, diving into memories he had long tried to forget. "It was tough," he admitted. "Foster homes, group homes. I never stayed in one place for long. I always wondered why I was abandoned, if I had any family out there." Anne listened intently, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. "And Paul, he never mentioned having a brother." Thomas shook his head. "I never knew I had a brother, let alone a twin." "It's surreal." For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of the revelation hanging between them. "Thomas," Anne finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know this is a lot to ask, but Sophie, she's missed her dad so much. Seeing you today, it was like a light came back into her life." Thomas felt his heart clench. "What are you suggesting, Anne?" She hesitated, clearly struggling with her emotions. "I'm not sure. I don't know if it's fair to ask, but maybe you could be part of her life, in some way." The proposition hung in the air, loaded with implications and possibilities. Thomas felt a mixture of fear, excitement, and confusion, but above all, an undeniable sense that this was something he needed to do. I would like that," he finally replied, his voice husky with emotion. "I'm not sure how it'll work, but I want to be here. For Sophie, and to find out more about Paul, about myself." Anne let out a shaky sigh, as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching for Thomas's hand and squeezing it gently. As the night wore on and the conversation continued, Thomas found himself reflecting on how life could change in an instant. That morning, he'd been a solitary billionaire, focused only on business and success. Now he stood on the threshold of a new life with a family he never knew he had. When he finally said goodnight to Anne, promising to return the next day, Thomas paused for a moment on the porch. He looked up at the starry sky, feeling as though the universe had aligned the stars for this moment. "Wherever you are, Paul," he murmured into the night, "I'm going to find out what happened, and I'll take care of your family until then." With one last glance at the house that now held so many promises and mysteries, Thomas walked back to his Ferrari, feeling like he was leaving behind not just a location, but an entire former life. The engine purred to life, but this time, the sound didn't bring the familiar feeling of freedom and power. Instead, it was a reminder that there was much more to life than wealth and success. There was family, connection, and a destiny that was only beginning to be revealed. As he drove through the night, Thomas knew his life would never be the same. The fateful encounter with Sophie had opened a door that couldn't be shut, and despite the challenges that would surely come, he was eager to find out what awaited him on the other side. In the days that followed the fateful meeting with Sophie and Anne, Thomas found himself consumed by a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The luxurious office at the top of a skyscraper, once his refuge, now felt suffocating. Every financial report, every business meeting seemed insignificant compared to the questions that now dominated his mind. Sitting in his leather chair, Thomas twirled a pen absently between his fingers, his eyes fixed on the panoramic view of the city, though his mind was elsewhere. Anne's words echoed incessantly in his ears. "I think you might be my husband's twin brother. How was that possible? How could he have lived 30 years without knowing he had a twin brother? Why had they been separated?" Every question led to another, forming a labyrinth of doubt and uncertainty. Thomas stood up abruptly, unable to focus on work. He walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. Below, the city pulsed with life, millions of people going about their daily routines, oblivious to the drama unfolding in these upper floors. His reflection stared back at him, and for the first time in his life, Thomas wondered if he truly knew the man in the mirror. Who was he really? What was his true story? With a heavy sigh, Thomas made a decision. He couldn't go on living with these doubts. He needed answers, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get them. Returning to his desk, Thomas picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "Hawthorne Investigations. Mr. Hawthorne. This is Thomas Blackwood. I need your services for a personal matter." As he explained the situation to the investigator, Thomas felt a mixture of anxiety and relief. Finally, he was taking concrete steps to uncover his past. In the following days, Thomas divided his time between managing his businesses and trying to contact Anne. Every unanswered call, every unreturned message, only fueled his frustration and determination. A week after hiring the investigator, Thomas received a phone call that would change everything. "Mr. Blackwood," Hawthorne's grave voice sounded on the other end of the line. "I have information you need to see in person." Thomas's heart pounded. "How urgent is it, Hawthorne?" "Urgent enough to justify an immediate visit to my office, sir." Thomas didn't hesitate. Within minutes, he was in his Ferrari, weaving through city traffic en route to the investigator's office. Hawthorne's office was a modest room in an old building downtown. Maps and newspaper clippings covered the walls, and the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke lingered in the air. Hawthorne, a middle-aged man with piercing eyes, gestured for Thomas to sit. "Mr. Blackwood, what I found, well, it's better you see for yourself." He slid a folder across the desk. With trembling hands, Thomas opened it. The first thing he saw was an old photo, yellowed by time, two identical babies sleeping side by side in a hospital crib. The date in the lower right corner was exactly his birth date. "My God," Thomas murmured, feeling the air leave the room. "There's more," Hawthorne said quietly, turning the page. Hospital documents, adoption records, and finally a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Twins Separated in Controversial Adoption." Thomas read voraciously, his heart pounding. The story detailed a scandal involving an adoption agency accused of separating twins to increase their chances of placement. Names were omitted to protect identities, but the dates lined up perfectly with his own story. "So it's true," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have a twin brother." Hawthorne nodded gravely. "And there's more. Mr. Blackwood, I managed to trace your brother's whereabouts up to 6 months ago. After that, he just vanished." Thomas shivered. 6 months ago. Exactly when Anne's husband and Paul had disappeared. "I need more information, Hawthorne. Everything you can find about my brother, about our separation, about what happened in the last 6 months. The investigator nodded. "I'm already working on it, Mr. Blackwood. But I must warn you, the deeper we dig, the more complicated this story becomes." Thomas stood, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "No matter the cost or time, Hawthorne, I need to know the truth." Leaving the investigator's office, Thomas felt shell-shocked. The city's familiar streets now seemed strange and alien to him, as if he were seeing everything for the first time. Without thinking, he found himself driving to his adoptive parents' home, the couple who took him in at 10, who loved and raised him as their own. Did they know? Had they kept the truth from him all these years? The suburban house, with its tidy garden and porch swing, looked like something out of a distant dream. Thomas parked the car and sat for a few minutes, gathering courage for what he was about to do. Finally, he got out and walked to the door. Before he could knock, it opened to reveal his worried-looking adoptive mother, Margaret. "Thomas, what's wrong, dear? You look pale." Margaret's gentle voice, so familiar and comforting, almost broke Thomas's resolve, but he needed to know. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling, "I need to talk to you and Dad. It's important." Margaret ushered him inside, calling for her husband Robert from the garage. As they sat in the living room, surrounded by family photos and memories of a happy childhood, Thomas felt a lump in his throat. "Thomas, son, what's going on?" Robert asked, concern evident in his voice. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I found out something about my past. I found out something you might not know. He pulled the photo of the twin babies from his pocket and placed it on the coffee table. Margaret gasped, covering her mouth. I have a twin brother, Thomas said, watching his parents closely. We were separated as babies. Did you know? The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret and Robert exchanged looks, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. Thomas, son, we had no idea. When we adopted you, we were told you were an only child. Margaret took Thomas's hand, tears shimmering in her eyes. If we had known... Oh, Thomas, you have to believe we would have done everything to keep you two together. Thomas felt a wave of relief and guilt. Part of him had feared his adoptive parents had hidden the truth from him all these years, but seeing the genuine surprise and pain on their faces, he knew they were as much victims of the situation as he was. I believe you, he said softly, squeezing his mother's hand. But now I need to find out the truth. I need to find my brother. Robert leaned forward, his expression serious. Thomas, whatever you need, we're here for you. We always have been, and we always will be. His adoptive father's words touched Thomas deeply. Despite the shocking revelation, their love and support remained unwavering. They spent the next few hours talking, recalling Thomas's adoption, searching for clues or signs they might have missed over the years. When Thomas finally said goodbye, it was late at night. Driving back to his apartment, Thomas felt emotionally drained but newly resolute. He had his adoptive family's love and support, but now he needed to discover the truth about his biological family. Arriving home, Thomas went straight to his office. He turned on his computer and began furiously searching for any information on twin separations, adoption scandals, anything that might shed light on his situation. The hours slipped by, and dawn was breaking when Thomas finally leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. His mind whirled with information, theories, and possibilities. Then his gaze fell on Anne's card, which he had placed on his desk days ago. Thomas picked it up, turning it over in his fingers, weighing his options. Anne had avoided his calls and messages in recent days, but now, with everything he had discovered, Thomas knew he needed to speak with her again. She was the link between him and his missing brother, Paul, and he suspected she knew more than she initially revealed. With renewed determination, Thomas picked up his phone. It didn't matter that it was the middle of the night. He couldn't wait another minute. The phone rang several times before it was answered. Anne's sleepy voice came through the line. Hello? Anne, it's Thomas. We need to talk, now. There was a pause, and Thomas could almost feel Anne's hesitation through the phone. Thomas, it's not a good time. Anne, please, Thomas pleaded, his voice laden with emotion. I found out about my twin brother, about Paul. I need to know everything you know. Another silence, this time longer. Finally, Anne let out a heavy sigh. All right, Thomas, come over. But be prepared. The truth isn't always easy to hear. Thomas barely registered the rest of the conversation. Within minutes, he was once again in his car, driving through the awakening city toward Anne's house, toward the answers he so desperately sought. As he drove, Thomas couldn't help reflecting on how his life had been turned upside down in so little time. A week ago, he was just Thomas Blackwood, the solitary billionaire. Now he was a man in search of his true identity, of a family he never knew he had. The rising sun painted the sky in pinks and golds as Thomas parked in front of Anne's house. For a moment, he sat in the car, gathering the courage to face what awaited him. Finally, with a determined sigh, he stepped out and walked to the door. Before he could knock, the door opened, revealing Anne. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes, but there was a resolve in her gaze Thomas had not seen before. Come in, she said simply, stepping aside. Thomas followed her into the kitchen, the silence between them heavy with unspoken expectations. Anne motioned for him to sit at the table while she made coffee. Finally, with 2 steaming cups between them, Anne looked directly at Thomas. "What exactly did you find out?" she asked, her voice calm but tense. Thomas took a deep breath. "I know I have a twin brother. I know we were separated at birth, part of some kind of adoption scandal, and I know that brother is Paul." Anne closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the impact of Thomas's words. When she opened them again, there was a mix of sadness and determination in her gaze. "Yes," she confirmed. "Paul always knew he had a twin brother. He spent years searching for you." Thomas felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "He knew all this time?" Anne nodded slowly. "He found out when he was 18. He stumbled upon some old documents from his adoptive parents. After that, it became almost an obsession for him." "But why didn't he ever find me?" Thomas asked, frustration evident in his voice. "I'm a public figure. It shouldn't have been hard to track me down." Anne looked away, a guilty expression crossing her face. "He did find you, Thomas, about a year ago." The shock of her words hit Thomas like a wave. "What? Then, why didn't he reach out?" Anne took a sip of coffee, as though trying to buy time to organize her thoughts. "Paul, he had his own demons, Thomas. When he finally located you, he saw how successful you were. A billionaire, respected, powerful. He felt inadequate." Thomas shook his head, incredulous. "That's ridiculous. He's my brother." "I know," Anne said softly. "I urged him to contact you, but Paul, he started spiraling into depression. He began drinking, and then..." She trailed off, tears forming in her eyes. "And then he disappeared," Thomas finished, the reality of the situation sinking in. Anne nodded, wiping away a tear. 6 months ago, no warning, no explanation, he just vanished. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions and shocking revelations. Thomas leaned back in his chair, trying to process everything he'd just heard. His brother had found him but chose not to make contact, and now he was missing. "Anne," Thomas finally said, his voice raw with emotion, "why didn't you tell me this before? Why did you avoid my calls?" Anne sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "I was scared, Thomas. This is all complicated. Paul disappeared, and then suddenly you show up. It's like the past is coming back to haunt us." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding Anne's fear and hesitation. "I get it, but now we have to work together. We need to find Paul." Anne looked at him, a mix of hope and skepticism in her eyes. "Do you really want to find him, even after knowing he chose not to reach out to you?" "He's my brother, Anne," Thomas said firmly. "No matter what happened in the past, he's out there somewhere, possibly needing help, and I have the resources to make a difference in the search." A small smile appeared on Anne's tired face. "Paul always said you two were stubborn. I guess he was right." Thomas couldn't help but smile in return. "So do we do this together? We find Paul?" Anne hesitated for a moment before reaching across the table to take Thomas's hand. "Together," she agreed. At that moment, the sound of small footsteps echoed down the hallway. Sophie appeared in the kitchen, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Mommy, Daddy," she murmured, looking back and forth between Anne and Thomas in confusion. Thomas felt his heart tighten. The situation with Sophie was another complex aspect that would need to be addressed, but for now, he simply gave the girl a gentle smile. "Good morning, Sophie," he said softly. "Your mum and I were just talking. Why don't you go back to bed? It's still early." Sophie nodded sleepily, allowing Anne to guide her back to her bedroom. When Anne returned, there was a new determination in her eyes. "Thomas," she said, sitting down again, "if we're going to do this, we need to be completely honest with each other. No more secrets, no half-truths." "Agreed." Thomas nodded solemnly. "Absolutely. From now on, total transparency. With that tacit agreement, Thomas and Anne spent the following hours sharing everything they knew. Thomas spoke of his investigation, of what he'd discovered about the twins' separation. Anne, in turn, provided more details about Paul's life, his ups and downs, and the mysterious circumstances of his disappearance. By the time the sun was high in the sky, they finally took a break, exhausted but with a renewed sense of purpose. "What do we do now?" Anne asked, looking at Thomas. Thomas stood, stretching his tense muscles. "Now, we use every resource at our disposal. I'll contact Hawthorne, my private investigator. We'll expand the search, use my contacts, do whatever it takes to find Paul." Anne nodded, a spark of hope shining in her eyes for the first time in months. "And what about Sophie? What do we tell her?" Thomas paused, considering carefully. "For now, I think we should keep things simple for her. She's been through so much with Paul's disappearance. We can say I'm a family friend helping to look for her dad. Over time, when we have more answers, we can explain the whole truth." Anne agreed, relief evident in her expression. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." Thomas gave her a gentle smile. "We're a family now, Anne, even if in a complicated and unexpected way. We'll get through this together." As he prepared to leave, Thomas felt a swirl of emotions well up inside him. Fear of the unknown, anxiety about what else he might discover, and a fierce determination to find his brother and finally complete the puzzle of his identity. Pausing at the door, he looked at Anne one last time. "I'll keep you updated on everything." "And Anne, thank you for trusting me." Anne smiled wearily but genuinely. "Thank you for not giving up, Thomas." With one final wave, Thomas stepped out into the bright morning light. As he walked to his car, he pulled out his phone and dialed Hawthorne's number. "Hawthorne, it's Thomas Blackwood. We have work to do. Meet me at my office in an hour. We're going to find my brother." Hanging up, Thomas looked up at the clear sky. Somewhere out there was Paul, his twin brother, a lost piece of himself, and Thomas was determined to find him, no matter the cost. With that burning resolve in his chest, he climbed into his car and drove off, ready to face whatever fate had in store. The search for Paul and for his own identity had only just begun. The afternoon sun cast long shadows along the quiet street as Thomas parked in front of Anne's house. He remained seated for a moment, his hands still on the wheel, taking deep breaths to calm himself. The past few weeks had been an emotional roller coaster, each new discovery about his past and his missing twin brother fueling his determination to get to the bottom of it all. With a final sigh, Thomas stepped out of the car and walked to the front door. Before he could knock, the door opened, revealing Anne. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, but there was a resolution in her gaze that Thomas hadn't seen before. "You came," Anne said, her voice a mix of relief and apprehension. Thomas nodded. "We need to talk, Anne. Really talk." Anne hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in," she said softly. "Sophie's at a friend's house. We'll have some privacy." Thomas followed her into the living room, noticing how different the house looked in daylight. Family photos lined the walls, most capturing happy moments of Anne, Paul, and Sophie, a bittersweet sight given current circumstances. Anne gestured for Thomas to take a seat on the couch while she took an armchair opposite him. For a moment, they remained silent, the weight of the upcoming conversation hanging in the air. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Anne, I know this is hard for you, but I need to understand. I need to know everything about Paul, about what happened." Anne closed her eyes for a moment as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, there was a mix of pain and resolve in her gaze. "All right," she said softly. "I guess it's time I told the whole story." She shifted in her seat, glancing at a photo of Paul on the wall before beginning. "Paul and I met in college. He was brilliant, charismatic, full of life. We fell in love quickly and got married soon after graduation. The first few years were wonderful. Paul had a promising job at a tech company. and I was starting my career as a teacher. We were young, in love, with the world at our feet. Anne smiled sadly at the memory before continuing. When Sophie was born, I thought our happiness was complete. Paul was a loving father, always playing with her, reading stories, making plans for the future. But then something changed. Thomas leaned forward, absorbing every word. What happened? Anne sighed deeply. It was gradual at first. Paul started working more, coming home late. He said it was because of a big project at work, but there was something in his eyes, a restlessness I'd never seen before. She paused, taking a glass of water from the coffee table and sipping before continuing. As the months passed, Paul became more and more distant. It wasn't just work, he seemed troubled, distracted. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at Sophie with a strange expression, almost guilt. Thomas frowned. Guilt? Why? Anne shook her head. I didn't know at the time. I tried talking to him, but Paul always changed the subject. He said he was just stressed, that things would get better soon. She rose abruptly, walking to the window and looking outside as if seeking strength in the familiar view of the yard. But things didn't get better. Paul started having sudden mood swings. One moment he'd be playing with Sophie. The next he'd lock himself in his office for hours. There were nights he just wouldn't come home, claiming he'd slept at the office. Thomas felt a pang of empathy. He could see the pain in Anne's eyes, the confusion and frustration she must have felt. When did you realize something was really wrong? He asked gently. Anne turned to face him, unshed tears in her eyes. It was about 6 months before he disappeared. Paul came home late one night, completely agitated. His eyes were red and his hands were shaking. He hugged me tightly, apologizing over and over. He said he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd put our family in danger. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of danger? Anne shook her head. He wouldn't tell me. He just kept saying he needed to fix things, that he'd find a way to protect us. I begged him to tell me what was happening, but Paul insisted that the less I knew, the safer I'd be. She sat back down, suddenly looking exhausted. In the weeks that followed, Paul seemed constantly on edge. He installed a new security system in the house, changed all our online passwords. He even suggested we move to another city, but I refused. My life, my job, Sophie's school, everything was here. Thomas processed each detail, his mind racing with possibilities. What could Paul have done that left him so terrified? And then, Anne continued, her voice almost a whisper, one morning, he was just gone. I woke up and found a note in the kitchen. It only said, "I'm sorry, I love you both, stay safe." And that was it. Paul vanished from our lives. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with emotion. Thomas could see how much it cost Anne to relive these painful memories. "Anne," he said softly, "I'm so sorry you went through this, but I have to ask. Do you have any idea what Paul might have done? Any clue about what scared him so much?" Anne hesitated, biting her lower lip. I'm not sure, but there was something a few weeks before he disappeared. I found a flash drive in his jacket pocket while doing laundry. When I tried to look at what was on it, I realized it was encrypted. Thomas leaned forward, intrigued. "Do you still have this flash drive?" Anne nodded slowly. "It's put away. I never managed to access its contents, but something told me not to get rid of it." "It could be important, Anne," Thomas said, his mind already racing with possibilities. "There might be crucial information on there." Before Anne could respond, the sound of the front door opening interrupted them. Quick, small footsteps echoed down the hall, and seconds later, Sophie rushed into the living room. "Mommy, Uncle Thomas," she exclaimed, her face lighting up when she saw the two of them. Thomas felt his heart clench when Sophie called him Uncle. It was a painful reminder of the well-intentioned lie they were keeping to protect the little girl. Anne forced a smile, quickly wiping away any traces of tears. "Hi, sweetheart. How was your time at your friend's house?" Sophie began chattering excitedly about her day, Completely oblivious to the tension filling the room moments before, Thomas observed how Anne interacted with her daughter, admiring her strength and resilience in the face of so much hardship. As Sophie spoke, Thomas couldn't help noticing the similarities between her and the photos of Paul on the wall. Same smile, same bright eyes. It was like looking at a mirror into his own past. After a few minutes, Anne gently suggested Sophie go play in her room, promising to join her soon for dinner. The little girl agreed happily, giving Thomas a quick hug before skipping away. Once alone again, the silence returned, heavier than before. "She's amazing," Thomas said softly, looking toward the direction Sophie had gone. Anne smiled, a genuine smile this time. "She's my strength. On the hardest days, it's her smile that keeps me going." Thomas nodded, understanding. He stood, walking to the window and looking out at the yard where a pink bicycle rested against a tree. "Anne," he said, turning to face her, "I want you to know that I'm not here just for Paul. I'm here for you and Sophie, too. You're family now." Anne looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. Thomas continued, "I know it's a complicated situation. There's a lot we still don't know, but I promise you, I will do everything in my power to find out what happened to Paul and to keep you and Sophie safe." Anne moved closer and, to Thomas's surprise, hugged him. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea how much this means." When they pulled apart, Thomas saw a renewed resolve in Anne's eyes. "The flash drive," she said. "I'll go get it. Maybe it's time we find out what Paul was hiding." Thomas nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation. As Anne left the room to retrieve the drive, he couldn't help thinking about how much his life had changed over the past few weeks. From a solitary billionaire to a man with a newly discovered family and a mystery to solve. Staring at a photo of Paul on the wall, Thomas made a silent promise to the brother he never knew. "I'll find you, Paul. And I'll uncover the truth, no matter the cost." With that resolve firmly in mind, Thomas readied himself for the next chapter of this unexpected journey, aware that the answers he sought could change everything once again. Thomas left Anne's house with his mind in turmoil. The story she had shared, the details of Paul's erratic behavior and sudden disappearance, had deeply unsettled him. As he drove back to his office, Thomas felt a growing determination. It was no longer just about discovering the truth of his past. It was about finding his brother and somehow fixing what had been broken. As soon as he arrived at the office, Thomas made a call. "Mr. Hawthorne, this is Thomas Blackwood. I need you to recommend someone specialized in missing persons cases." In the days that followed, Thomas found himself splitting his time between running his business empire and delving headfirst into the search for Paul. He hired Diana Reeves, a former police detective with an impeccable reputation for handling disappearances. "Mr. Blackwood," Diana said in their first meeting, her sharp eyes scanning Thomas, "you need to understand that cases like this can lead to some dark places. Are you prepared for what we might find?" Thomas nodded gravely. "I'm prepared for anything, Ms. Reeves. I just need to find my brother." While Diana began her investigation, Thomas made frequent visits to Anne and Sophie. Part of him felt it was his duty to be there, to fill in for Paul in some way. But there was also an unexpected comfort in those visits, a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. One sunny afternoon, as he watched Sophie play in the yard, Thomas sensed Anne approaching. "She loves it when you come," Anne said softly, a slight smile on her lips. Thomas felt a rush of conflicting emotions. On one hand, a genuine joy in being part of Sophie's life. On the other, a lingering anger toward Paul for abandoning this wonderful family. "Anne," he began hesitantly, "I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'll be here for both of you." Anne looked at him, gratitude and something else in her eyes. "Thank you, Thomas. That means a lot." Weeks passed, and Thomas became increasingly involved in Anne and Sophie's lives. While Diana relentlessly pursued leads on Paul, It was on a rainy afternoon that Diana finally called with news. "Mr. Blackwood, I have some leads, but I'm not sure you'll like what we've found." Thomas felt his heart race. "Tell me, Diana. I need to know." Diana hesitated before speaking. "It appears your brother has been battling drug addiction for years, Mr. Blackwood. We found records of multiple stints in rehab that coincide with the absences Anne mentioned." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling as though he'd been punched. Drugs. It explained so much, yet opened a new world of worries. "There's more," Diana went on. "Paul has accumulated significant debts in recent years. We found records of unpaid loans, overdue bills, and it seems he may have gotten involved in illegal activities to obtain money." Thomas felt his head spin. How could Paul, seemingly so bright and promising, have reached this point? "Mr. Blackwood," Diana's voice brought him back, "there's one more thing. One of my contacts spotted someone matching Paul's description in an area known for drug trafficking on the west side of the city. This was just 2 days ago." Thomas stood abruptly, his mind racing. Paul was alive. He was in the city, and he was in danger. "Send me the address, Diana," he said, his voice thick with determination. "I'm going to look for him myself." "Mr. Blackwood, I must warn you this could be extremely dangerous. Perhaps it's better to let professional—" "No," Thomas cut her off. "He's my brother. I have to do this." After hanging up, Thomas stood in his office, staring out the window at the city below. Should he tell Anne about his findings? Part of him wanted to protect her from the harsh reality of what Paul had become, but another part knew she deserved the truth. Deciding this was a burden he would bear alone for now, Thomas prepared for what could be the most important encounter of his life. He changed from his expensive suit into more discreet clothes, hid a considerable sum of money in his pocket, and after a moment's hesitation, placed the old photo of him and Paul as babies into his wallet. As he headed toward the seedy part of town Diana had mentioned, Thomas felt a mix of fear and resolve. What would he find? How would Paul react? And most importantly, could he bring his brother back? The streets grew darker and the buildings more run down as Thomas neared his destination, the weight of his mission pressing down on him. He wasn't just searching for his lost twin brother, he was seeking answers, redemption, and perhaps a chance to mend a broken family. Heart racing and senses on high alert, Thomas parked his car and stepped onto the dimly lit street. The search for Paul, and for answers, was about to enter its most dangerous and crucial phase. The soft rumble of the Ferrari's engine echoed through the narrow, poorly lit streets of the neighborhood. Thomas slowed down, his eyes scanning every alley and corner for a familiar figure. The stark contrast between his luxury car and the surrounding decay couldn't have been more striking. Finally, Thomas parked in a side alley, choosing to continue on foot. Each step took him deeper into the city's underbelly, a place he never imagined he would visit. The smell of garbage and urine hung in the air, mixed with the acrid tang of smoke and despair. As he walked, Thomas felt curious and sometimes hostile stares from the homeless and shadowy figures lurking nearby. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and anticipation coursing through his veins. Was he really prepared for what he might find? Then he saw him. In a narrow alley, illuminated only by a single flickering lamp, stood a hunched figure leaning against a brick wall. Even in the dim light, Thomas recognized the familiar features. It was like looking into a warped mirror of himself. "Paul," Thomas called softly, taking a hesitant step toward the alley. The figure startled, turning around quickly. Bloodshot, wary eyes met Thomas's. For a moment, only confusion crossed Paul's face. Who are you?" Paul mumbled, his voice rough and shaky. Thomas felt his heart clench at the sight of his twin in such a state. "Paul, it's me. Thomas, your brother." The confusion on Paul's face slowly gave way to shock. He blinked several times, as if trying to clear his vision. "Thomas? No, you shouldn't be here." Thomas took another step forward, keeping his hands visible in a gesture of peace. "It's true, Paul. I'm your twin brother. I came looking for you." Paul shrank back, pressing himself against the wall. His posture was an odd mix of defensive and curious. How did you find me? Why are you here?" "I hired an investigator," Thomas explained calmly. "Paul, your family is worried. Anne, Sophie, they miss you." At the mention of Anne and Sophie, Paul's face contorted with pain and shame. "No, you shouldn't have come. They're better off without me." Thomas felt a wave of frustration and anger rise within him. "Better off without you? Paul, you abandoned them. They're hurting, trying to understand why you just disappeared." Paul shook his head violently, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "You don't understand. I had to leave. It was the only way to protect them." "Protect them from what, Paul?" Thomas pressed, taking another step forward. "What happened? What did you do?" For a moment, the fog in Paul's eyes seemed to clear. He looked directly at Thomas, and for the first time, Thomas saw the pain and regret there. "I messed up, Thomas," Paul whispered, his voice broken. "The drugs, I thought I could control them, but they controlled me. Then the debts started piling up. I did terrible things to get money." Thomas felt his heart twist at Paul's confession. "But why didn't you ask for help? Anne would have understood. I could have helped." Paul let out a bitter laugh. "Help? Look at you, Thomas. Successful, rich, powerful. How could I show up in your life as a failed drug addict? How could I face Anne and Sophie after everything I did?" "So you just ran," Thomas shot back, the frustration evident in his voice. "Left them with no explanation, no idea whether you were alive or dead." Paul recoiled at Thomas's harsh words. For a moment, silence loomed between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the city. I'm sorry," Paul finally muttered, tears glistening in his eyes. "I wanted to be strong. I wanted to fix my mess before I went back to them. But every day that passes, I sink deeper." Thomas felt his anger melt away, replaced by deep compassion. He took another step toward Paul, stretching out his hand. "It's not too late, Paul. We can fix this together. Let me help you." For a brief moment, Paul seemed to consider the offer. His eyes, so like Thomas's, shone with a flicker of hope. But then, as if a switch was flipped, fear and distrust returned. "No," Paul said abruptly, backing away. "You don't understand. It's dangerous. I have to go." Before Thomas could react, Paul turned and ran to the back of the alley, disappearing into the shadows. "Paul, wait!" Thomas shouted, sprinting after him. But when he reached the end of the alley, Paul was gone, swallowed by the night's darkness. Thomas stood there, breathing heavily, staring into the void where his brother had vanished. The long-awaited, feared encounter had ended as abruptly as it began. But one thing was certain: Thomas wouldn't give up. Now that he had found Paul, he would do everything in his power to bring him back and help him rebuild his life. With a heavy heart yet firm resolve, Thomas walked back to his car. The drive home had never felt so long, his mind consumed by worries about Paul and uncertainty over what to do next. One thing, however, was clear. The search wasn't over. It was only beginning. The drive home after his encounter with Paul in the alley was a blur for Thomas. His mind whirled, replaying each moment of that brief and intense interaction with his twin brother. The image of Paul, unkempt, frightened, and clearly battling his demons, burned in his memory. Stepping into his luxurious apartment, Thomas suddenly felt out of place. The contrast between his world of privilege and the dark reality Paul inhabited was jarring and uncomfortable. He poured himself a whiskey more out of habit than desire, then walked to the large picture window, offering a breathtaking view of the city. Somewhere down there, in the night's shadows, Paul was fighting to survive. And here he was, Thomas, surrounded by comfort and safety. Guilt and helplessness consumed him. "What do I do now?" Thomas murmured to himself, his reflection in the glass returning a lost, weary gaze. The most pressing issue was whether to tell Anne about his meeting with Paul. On one hand, she deserved to know the truth about Sophie's father, the man she still loved, despite everything. On the other, the truth was painful and potentially devastating. How would Anne react upon learning Paul was living on the streets, trapped in addiction? And Sophie, the sweet, innocent child who still believed her father might return one day, how could he protect her from this harsh reality? Thomas spent the night awake, wrestling with these questions. When dawn broke, he was no closer to an answer. Realizing he needed professional guidance for such a sensitive emotional battlefield, Thomas scheduled an emergency appointment with Dr. Evelyn Carter, a renowned therapist specializing in trauma and complex family dynamics. In Dr. Carter's elegant and welcoming office, Thomas poured out his entire story, from discovering his adoption to his unsettling encounter with Paul in the alley. Dr. Carter listened attentively, her face a calm mask of professional composure. When Thomas finished and she leaned forward, her gaze kind yet piercing. "Thomas," she began, "you're dealing with an incredibly complex and emotionally charged situation. It's understandable that you feel overwhelmed and uncertain." Thomas nodded, grateful to have someone who seemed to grasp the enormity of what he was facing. "As for whether to tell Anne," Dr. Carter continued, "we need to consider the ethical and emotional implications. Anne has a right to know about Sophie's father, but we also have to think about the impact that information will have on her and on Sophie. What if I tell her and she decides to go looking for Paul?" Thomas asked, voicing one of his biggest fears. "She could be putting herself in danger." Dr. Carter nodded sympathetically. "That's a real risk. However, keeping this secret also has consequences. It could affect your trust relationship with Anne and eventually with Sophie." They discussed for another hour, weighing the pros and cons of each path. Dr. Carter guided Thomas in exploring his own conflicting feelings. "Thomas, it's evident you feel responsible not just for Paul but also for Anne and Sophie," she observed. "How are you coping with this sudden increase in responsibility?" Thomas paused, considering the question. "It's overwhelming at times," he admitted. "A few weeks ago, it was just me. Suddenly, I have a brother desperately needing help, and a family that depends on me in some way. It's scary, but at the same time, I feel like I finally have a greater purpose than just making money." Dr. Carter offered a gentle smile. "That's a very mature perspective, Thomas. But remember, you also need to take care of yourself in the process. You can't help others if you're emotionally drained." Thomas nodded, absorbing the advice. "How do I do that? How do I balance all of this?" "Start by setting clear boundaries," Dr. Carter suggested. "Decide how far you're willing to go to help Paul and communicate that clearly to Anne. Also, carve out time for yourself to process your own emotions and recharge." By the end of the session, Dr. Carter offered a piece of counsel that deeply resonated with Thomas. "Honesty, while painful, is usually the best route in the long run," she said. "But how you present that truth is crucial. Anne will need support and resources to handle this information. And as for Sophie, you and Anne will need to work together to decide what to tell her and how, given her age and emotional maturity." Thomas left the session feeling more centered but still apprehensive. He knew what he needed to do, but telling Anne was no less frightening. Over the next few days, Thomas tried to act normal during his visits to Anne and Sophie. He made an effort to be present, playing with Sophie in the yard and helping Anne with household tasks. But inside, he wrestled with the knowledge he hadn't yet shared. Anne, ever perceptive, noticed something was off. The worried looks she threw at Thomas didn't go unnoticed. Finally, one sunny afternoon, while Sophie happily played on her swing set, Anne confronted Thomas. "Thomas," she said softly, touching his arm to get his attention, "what's going on? You've been distant, worried. Did something happen?" Thomas felt his heart pound. The moment of truth had arrived. He took a deep breath, preparing for what was about to come. "Anne," he began, his voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you. It's about Paul." Anne's face instantly went pale, her eyes widening with a mix of fear and hope. "Paul? You found him?" Thomas nodded solemnly. "Yes, I did. Anne, maybe we should sit down for this conversation. It's complicated." Anne glanced worriedly at Sophie, still blissfully unaware, then back at Thomas. "I'll ask Mrs. Johnson to watch Sophie for a few hours," Anne said, referring to the trusted neighbor. "That will give us time to talk without interruptions." Thomas agreed, grateful for the suggestion. While Anne made the arrangements, he tried to calm his nerves, recalling Dr. Carter's advice. Minutes later, with Sophie safe at the neighbor's, Thomas and Anne sat in the living room once more. The silence between them was palpable, charged with expectation and apprehension. "Anne," Thomas began, his voice soft but firm. "First of all, I want you to know that I'm here for you and Sophie no matter what. What I'm about to tell you isn't easy, but I believe you deserve to know the truth." Anne nodded, her eyes never leaving Thomas's. "Just tell me, Thomas. Please." Thomas drew in a deep breath and told her everything. The alley, the condition in which he found Paul, the tense and confusing conversation they had. He watched Anne's face cycle through shock, pain, anger, and fear. "Drugs," Anne whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. He was using drugs all this time." Thomas nodded sadly. "It seems so. Paul mentioned things spiraling out of control, about piling debts. Anne, he was in a really bad state." Anne stood abruptly, walking to the window. Her shoulders trembled with suppressed sobs. "How could he do this? How could he abandon us like that?" Thomas approached carefully, placing a reassuring hand on Anne's shoulder. "He said he was trying to protect you, that he was afraid of bringing danger into your lives." Anne turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a mix of rage and sorrow. "Protect us by leaving us without an explanation, leaving Sophie without a father. What kind of protection is that, Thomas?" "I know," Thomas said softly. "I'm not defending his actions, Anne. I'm just telling you what he told me. Paul wasn't thinking clearly." Anne pulled away, hugging herself as though she felt cold. "What do we do now, Thomas? How do we tell Sophie that her father's alive but can't see her? How do we help him when he clearly doesn't want help?" Thomas hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. I want to help him, Anne. I know it's complicated, but he's my brother, and he's Sophie's father. I believe that with the right resources, we can give him the help he needs." Anne stared at him, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "And if he doesn't want help? If he brings more trouble into our lives, into Sophie's life? We've already been through so much, Thomas. I can't put my daughter at risk." "I understand your concern," Thomas said calmly. "And you're right to put Sophie first. But we can't just abandon him. He needs help, Anne, professional, medical. Maybe there's a way to help him without putting you and Sophie in danger." Anne shook her head, running her hands over her exhausted face. "I know. It's just part of me wants to help him, bring him back. But another part is so angry, so hurt by what he's done. How can I trust him again? How can I let him back into Sophie's life knowing he might vanish at any moment?" Thomas nodded understandingly. "It's normal to feel that way, Anne. What Paul did, there's no excuse. But maybe, together, we can find a way to help him while also protecting you and Sophie." Anne looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and apprehension in her eyes. "How would we do that?" "We could start by looking for rehab facilities," Thomas suggested. "Places where he can get proper treatment, away from the streets and the drugs. I can cover the costs, make sure he has the best treatment possible." "And if he refuses?" Anne asked, worry evident in her voice. Thomas sighed. "Then we keep trying. We can't force him, but we can be there, ready to help when he's open to it. Maybe we can bring in professionals specialized in interventions for addicts. They'd have more experience in approaching someone like Paul." Anne nodded slowly, seeming a bit calmer. And Sophie, what do we tell her? How do we explain that her father's alive but not able to see her? For now, maybe it's best not to tell her everything, Thomas said carefully. We can say we found Paul, that he's sick and needs help. We don't need to go into details about drugs or his situation on the streets. We can work with a child therapist to find the best way to approach her. Anne considered for a moment before agreeing. You're right. She's too young to understand all of this. But Thomas, if we do this, we need to set clear boundaries. Sophie's emotional well-being and safety come first. Absolutely, Thomas agreed emphatically. We can set up a plan, define steps and conditions Paul has to meet before any contact with Sophie. Maybe start with letters or supervised calls, gradually progressing if he shows commitment to recovery. Anne looked at Thomas, her eyes softening. You really do care, don't you, about all of us? Thomas felt a lump in his throat. You're my family now, Anne. Maybe not in the conventional sense, but you are. I want to do what's best for everyone. Anne came closer, taking Thomas's hand. Thank you for being here, for caring. I don't know if I can forgive Paul yet, but maybe with time, and if he really tries to change, we can find a way forward. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. One day at a time, okay? We don't have to have all the answers right now. We'll make decisions as we go, always prioritizing Sophie and you. They fell silent for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Anne spoke, her voice low but determined. Okay, Thomas, let's try to help him, but we need to be smart and cautious about it. No direct contact with Sophie until we're sure it's safe, and we need a solid plan before we approach Paul again. Thomas nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. I couldn't agree more. We can start by researching the best rehab centers and consulting addiction specialists. I also think it's important we continue sessions with Dr. Carter or another therapist to help us navigate this situation. Anne agreed. That sounds like a good start. And Thomas, thank you for being honest with me. I know it must have been hard to decide to tell me. Thomas gave her a soft smile. You deserve to know, Anne. We're in this together now. As they prepared to pick Sophie up, Thomas couldn't help feeling the weight of the responsibility he now carried. Finding Paul had been just the first step in what would likely be a long and potentially painful journey. But looking at Anne, seeing the strength and determination in her eyes, he knew he wasn't alone. Together, they would face whatever the future held, united by the desire to help Paul and protect the small family they had become. The road ahead would be difficult, full of obstacles and tough decisions, but Thomas was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, Thomas and Anne began to outline a plan of action. They researched extensively about rehab centers, consulted with experts in addiction treatment, and kept regular appointments with Dr. Carter. Each step was carefully considered, always putting Sophie's well-being first. Thomas also intensified his efforts to locate Paul again. He hired discreet investigators to keep an eye on the area where he'd last been spotted, hoping for another opportunity to make contact. The thought of his brother living on the streets, battling addiction, weighed on him constantly. Meanwhile, the relationship between Thomas, Anne, and Sophie continued to grow. Thomas became a constant presence in their lives, offering emotional and practical support. Sophie, in her childlike innocence, welcomed Uncle Thomas wholeheartedly, unknowingly filling the gap her father had left behind. One evening, after putting Sophie to bed, Anne found Thomas on the porch, gazing pensively at the stars. "What's on your mind?" she asked softly, joining him. Thomas sighed. Just how quickly life can change. A few months ago, I was just a solitary businessman. Now, I have a family, a missing brother, and responsibilities I never imagined. Anne placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Do you regret it?" Thomas looked at her, a gentle smile on his lips. "Not for a second. It's scary, it's complicated, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing something that really matters." Anne returned his smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know what we would have done without you, Thomas. You brought hope back into our lives." They fell silent, contemplating the night sky. The future was still uncertain, full of challenges and potential heartbreak. The fight to save Paul was only beginning, and the path to healing for all of them would be long and hard. But in that moment, under the stars, with the soft sound of Sophie's breathing on the baby monitor, Thomas felt a peace he had never known. He knew that, no matter what happened, they would face it together, as a family. "One day at a time," Thomas murmured, more to himself than to Anne. Anne nodded in understanding. "One day at a time," she agreed. And so, as the night wore on, Thomas and Anne stayed on the porch, drawing comfort from each other's presence and silently promising to face whatever the future held. Together. The days following Thomas and Anne's decision to help Paul were a mixture of frantic activity and palpable anxiety. Thomas threw himself into the task of finding the best addiction specialists, using his influence and resources to schedule appointments with the most renowned experts. Dr. Elena Morales, a psychiatrist with decades of experience handling complex addiction cases, was the first to join their team. Her compassionate yet firm approach immediately earned Thomas and Anne's trust. "You have to understand," Dr. Morales explained at their first meeting, "that Paul's recovery will be a long, difficult journey. There will be relapses, moments of doubt and frustration. The key is to remain steadfast and offer consistent support, but also to set clear boundaries." Thomas nodded, taking in every word. "And for the initial approach, how do we offer Paul help?" Dr. Morales leaned forward, her stare intense. "The intervention must be carefully planned. Paul needs to feel he has a choice, but also understand the severity of his situation. I suggest a team approach, with trained professionals leading the conversation." Following Dr. Morales' guidance, Thomas and Anne began preparing for an intervention. Private investigators were hired to discreetly track Paul's movements, waiting for the ideal moment to approach him. 2 weeks later, the opportunity arose. Paul was spotted in a park not far from the alley where Thomas had first found him. The intervention team, led by Dr. Morales and including Thomas, positioned themselves. The meeting was tense from the start. Paulie, seeing Thomas approaching with strangers, tried to flee. It was Dr. Morales' calm, firm voice that made him hesitate. "Paul," she called, "we're here to help. Your brother, your family, they care about you." Paul slowly turned, his bloodshot, wary eyes shifting between Thomas and the others. "I don't need help," he muttered, but his voice quivered. Thomas stepped forward, his heart clenching at Paul's deteriorated condition. "Paul, please, just hear us out. We're not here to judge or force you into anything you don't want. We just want to offer an option, a chance to change things." For nearly an hour, right there in the park, the team talked to Paul. Dr. Morales explained the treatment options, emphasizing that the final decision was his. Thomas spoke of Anne and Sophie, how they missed him, but also how he needed to be healthy before any reunion. Initially hostile and defensive, Paul gradually lowered his guard. Tears streamed down his dirt-streaked face as he finally admitted, "I'm tired. So tired of living like this." In that moment of vulnerability, Thomas knew they had a real chance. "Let us help you, Paul," he urged softly. "You're not alone in this." After what felt like an eternity, Paul slowly nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll try." The relief Thomas felt was almost overwhelming. But he knew this was only the first step of a very long road. In the days that followed, as Paul was admitted to a secure rehab facility, Thomas found himself grappling with a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Relief that they'd finally reached Paul, fear for the long road ahead, and a strange mix of love and resentment for the brother he barely knew. During one of his sessions with Dr. Carter, Thomas poured out his thoughts. "Part of me wants to hug him and never let go. Another part wants to yell at him for everything he's put Anne and Sophie through. How do I reconcile these feelings? Dr. Carter smiled gently. It's perfectly normal to feel that way, Thomas. You're dealing with years of separation, unmet expectations, and the complex reality of who Paul has become. The key is allowing yourself to feel all those emotions without judgment. In time, you'll find balance. Meanwhile, Anne faced her own challenges. Preparing Sophie for potential changes in the family dynamic was delicate. With help from a child therapist, Anne began having careful conversations with her daughter. "Sophie, sweetie," Anne said one night as she tucked her into bed, "remember how we talked about your dad being sick and needing special help?" Sophie nodded, her big eyes fixed on her mother. "Well, your dad is getting that help now. And maybe soon, when he's feeling better, you'll be able to see him." Sophie's eyes lit up. "Really, Mommy, I'll get to see Daddy?" Anne smiled, though Thomas could see the tension in her eyes. "Maybe, honey. But first, Daddy has to get a lot better. And even when that happens, things might be a little different." As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Paul slowly began making progress in rehab. Reports from the facility were cautiously optimistic, though there were relapses and difficult times. Thomas found himself playing mediator between Paul, Anne, and the medical team. He visited Paul regularly, bringing updates about Anne and Sophie, and returning carefully written messages from Paul to his family. During one visit, Paul, looking healthier than Thomas had ever seen him, expressed his gratitude. "I don't deserve this, Thomas. I don't deserve a second chance after everything I've done." Thomas felt a tightness in his throat. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Paul. What matters is what you do with it." Anne, meanwhile, wrestled with her own demons. The anger over being abandoned still burned, but it was tempered by compassion as she saw Paul's progress and by the desire to give Sophie the chance to know her father. "I don't know if I'll ever fully trust him again," Anne admitted to Thomas during one of their many late-night coffees, "but I see how Sophie lights up each time we talk about him. She deserves the chance to have a father, if Paul has truly changed." Finally, after 6 months of intensive treatment, the doctors gave the green light for a supervised meeting between Paul and Sophie. The day was carefully planned, with therapists present to guide the interaction. The moment Sophie saw Paul for the first time in over a year took everyone's breath away. She stood still for an instant, as if she couldn't believe her eyes, before sprinting into his arms, sobbing, "Daddy, you're back." Paul, tears in his own eyes, held his daughter tight. "Yes, Princess, Daddy's here. And I promise I'll try my hardest to stay." Thomas and Anne watched with a mix of emotions, joy at Sophie's evident happiness, apprehension about the future, hope that this truly was a fresh start for their unusual family. But not everything was rosy. As Paul made progress in his recovery and began gradually reintegrating into family life, the outside world wasn't always understanding. Judgmental stares and whispered comments followed the family whenever they went out together. There were also legal complications. Paul's prolonged absence raised questions about his parental rights, and lawyers had to be involved to navigate the unique complexities of his situation. Determined to offer this new family all the support they needed, Thomas decided it was time to bring everyone together. He arranged a meeting with his adoptive parents, hoping they could provide additional stability and support in this delicate time. The gathering was emotional and occasionally tense. Thomas's adoptive parents, initially shocked by the entire situation, soon melted upon meeting Sophie. Seeing the two brothers together for the first time was a surreal moment for them. "We never imagined we'd see this day," Thomas's adoptive mother said, tears in her eyes, "but we're so grateful this family has found each other." As the evening wore on, with Sophie dozing off in her newly discovered grandfather's lap and the adults speaking quietly, Thomas found himself reflecting on the incredible journey that had led them there. From a solitary billionaire to an integral part of this complicated yet loving family, the road ahead would still be full of challenges. Paul's recovery was an ongoing battle. Anne would have days when trust seemed impossible. Sophie would have to navigate the complexity, of having a father who'd been absent for so long. Yet, looking around the room, seeing the smiles, the tears of joy, the hands clasped in support, Thomas felt a surge of hope. They would face whatever came next together, one day at a time. As everyone began saying their goodbyes, Paul pulled Thomas aside. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up on me. For bringing our family back together." Thomas hugged his brother, feeling the weight of all those lost years and the promise of the years to come in that embrace. "Always, Paul. From now on, we're here for each other." And so, as the night drew to a close, Thomas knew that this wasn't a happy ever after fairy tale ending. It was a new beginning, filled with both promise and challenges. But for the first time in his life, he felt truly whole, not because of his success or wealth, but because of this imperfect, wonderful family that was now his. The journey to redemption would be long, but Thomas was determined to walk it by his brother's side, along with Anne, Sophie, and everyone else who was now part of this extraordinary story of second chances and unconditional love. As the night wore on and conversations died down, Thomas found himself in a moment of quiet reflection. He watched Paul, seated on the couch with Sophie asleep in his lap, gently stroking his daughter's hair. Anne was nearby, her expression a mix of caution and hope. Thomas's adoptive parents spoke softly with her, offering words of encouragement and support. The family tableau, so common yet so extraordinary given all they had overcome, filled Thomas with an emotion he could barely name: gratitude, hope, and a profound sense of purpose, all mixed together. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. Paul's recovery would continue to be a constant battle with ups and downs. Anne would have to keep working to rebuild trust, a process that would take time and patience. Sophie would adapt to having her father back in her life, relearning who he was. And Thomas, he was still discovering his new role in this unconventional family: brother and uncle, coward friend, pillar of support. So many hats to wear, and sometimes the responsibility felt overwhelming. But gazing at the people gathered in that room, Thomas knew he wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. When the evening finally ended and everyone said their farewells, there was a sense of optimism in the air. Plans were made for future family gatherings, promises of support were renewed, and warm hugs were exchanged. As Thomas prepared to leave, Paul pulled him aside once more. "Thomas," he said, his voice low and emotional, "I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. Thank you for finding me, for not giving up, for bringing our family back together. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay all you've done." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. He placed a hand on Paul's shoulder, looking into eyes so similar to his own. "Paul, you don't need to repay anything. We're brothers, family. We're in this together now. Okay?" Paul nodded, tears shining in his eyes. The two brothers embraced, a hug that seemed to carry the weight of all the lost years and the promise of those yet to come. When Thomas finally stepped out into the cool night air, he paused to look back at the warmly lit house. Through the window, he could see the silhouettes of his newly united family: Paul, Anne, Sophie, his adoptive parents, a constellation of people who, against all odds, had found their way to each other. Thomas smiled to himself, feeling a peace unlike anything he had experienced before. The future was uncertain, packed with obstacles and potential setbacks, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't facing that future alone. He had a family, a purpose, and a place where he truly belonged. Climbing into his car, Thomas made a silent promise to himself and to everyone who was now part of his life. He would do everything possible to protect, nurture, and strengthen these newly discovered bonds. The road to redemption, not just for Paul, but for all of them in their own way, would be long and sometimes hard. But together they would travel it one day at a time, armed with love, understanding, and the strength that only a real family can provide. With that comforting thought, Thomas started the car and drove home, looking forward to whatever tomorrow might bring for his extraordinary new family. Months passed, bringing subtle yet significant changes for the newly formed family. Paul, now 6 months out of rehab, faced his daily struggles with renewed determination. There were hard days, moments of weakness, but he stayed strong in his commitment to sobriety, buoyed by the support network Thomas had helped build. Thomas, meanwhile, found himself splitting his time between running his business empire and his new family life. Frequent visits to Anne and Sophie's house became an essential part of his routine. He was there for Sunday dinners, Sophie's school performances, and the small daily victories marking Paul's progress. Anne, initially wary, began to lower her defenses. Thomas's steady, reliable presence, combined with Paul's sincere efforts to redeem himself, helped her gradually rebuild trust. She learned to lean on both brothers, discovering a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Sophie, with the natural adaptability of children, adjusted remarkably well to the new family dynamic. She formed a unique relationship with each brother. With Paul, there were poignant moments of reconnection tempered by the natural caution of someone still learning to trust. With Thomas, she had a special bond filled with laughter, stories, and a shared understanding that sometimes surprised even Anne. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, Thomas arrived at Anne's house to find Paul already there, helping Sophie prepare to ride her bike without training wheels for the first time. The scene made him stop for a moment, observing the interaction between father and daughter. "Uncle Thomas," Sophie called, running toward him with her pink helmet askew. "You came to watch me ride my bike?" Thomas smiled, adjusting her helmet. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Princess." Paul approached, a hesitant smile on his face. "Hey, bro. Glad you could make it. I think I might need backup here." The two brothers exchanged a knowing look. Over the past months, they had learned to work together, each complementing the other's strengths. Anne watched from the porch, a cup of coffee in her hands and a soft smile on her lips. She still had her moments of doubt, but scenes like this gave her hope. While Thomas held the bike and Paul encouraged Sophie, Thomas couldn't help reflecting on how drastically his life had changed since that fateful encounter with Sophie nearly a year ago. From a solitary billionaire focused solely on business, he had become an integral part of this loving, if unconventional, family. "Okay, Sophie, are you ready?" Paul asked, his voice tinged with excitement and anxiety. Sophie nodded with determination. "I'm ready, Daddy." Thomas gripped the handlebars, steadying the bike while Sophie settled onto the seat. With a nod from Paul, he started pushing gently, jogging alongside the bike. "Pedal, Sophie." "You can do it," Paul shouted, running on the other side. For a moment, everything felt perfect. Sophie was pedaling, laughing gleefully, while Thomas and Paul ran alongside her. Then, as expected, she wobbled. But before she could fall, 4 hands were there to catch her, Thomas's and Paul's. Together, they steadied her, allowing her to keep going. "Did you see that?" "I did it!" Sophie exclaimed in triumph. Thomas and Paul exchanged a proud, knowing look. In that moment, every struggle and challenge of the past months felt worth it. Anne joined them, clapping enthusiastically. "My little champion!" As Sophie continued pedaling with growing confidence, Thomas found himself thinking about the symbolism of the moment. Just as Sophie was learning to find her balance on the bike, all of them were learning to navigate this new family dynamic. There would be falls, of that he was certain. But there would also be hands ready to help, to lift up, to encourage. And in the end, that was what truly mattered. As the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, Thomas looked at his family, Paul laughing and running after Sophie, Anne, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and love, and Sophie, riding with determination, her face alight with the joy of accomplishment. Thomas smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude wash over him. This wasn't the end of his story. He knew that. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, filled with promise, challenges, and above all else, love. And as night gently fell around them, Thomas knew in his heart that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, like a family.